Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that is always up to date, even when it misses an election announcement or three. So, how are you, Rob?
Let's go! Let's go! It's election time. We've got an election. How many elections have we had since we've been doing this podcast? One, maybe? Two?
I think two, in that this was kind of spawned out of the analysis of the 2016 one, right?
Yeah.
Because we did that with on How Many Things. We did a one-off episode on like Brexit and stuff, and then I think we did a one-off episode when Theresa May had her narrow majority with the DUP. And then, yes, that means we've only technically covered one election here, but that was in 2019, which kind of shows you how long this podcast has been going. It's weird to think we've been doing this for nearly 8 years. So yeah,
it's the first time, I don't know, in my voting life, first election I ever voted in when I was 18, 2010. So if you're looking for somebody who's had 14 years of Conservative government whilst being able to vote, that's me. That's this guy. So, yeah.
I think I'm in the same position, although we were able to flip a Conservative seat to a Lib Dem seat in 2010, the place I lived, because it was a student area. And we were like, congratulating ourselves. What a great thing we've done. And then it turned out coalition was not as fun as we thought it was going to be, but probably better than not being in coalition afterwards. But essentially 14 years, of some form of Conservative rule since we've both been able to vote.
For somebody who follows so much politics, thinking about it, I don't think I've ever voted an election and my vote has mattered. And by that, I mean has counted to the eventual winner of either the seat that I am in or the result across the country. That includes Brexit referenda, local council, maybe some local things have been fun. I think I helped to elect the police and crime commissioner and the mayor. So I might be a little bit, but nationally, I have felt somewhat frustrated in my position in democracy. But now we get to democratize, baby. It's here. Like, I'm ready for it. I think the country is fed up of it already, but we'll talk about it. But it has been, for me, one of the weirdest election cycles that I can remember. And that's for a number of reasons. But like, how are you feeling in general? Are you feeling like as engaged as previous elections, or are you like matching the mood of the country where it's like, okay, kind of paying attention, but
I think I'm paying a lot of attention. I mean, partly because I'm on a politics podcast, and that's part of like, like I'm more switched on to various things than I was. We were discussing in our Patreon bonus episode, which we did just before this, the various podcasts we listen to get our political news to try and I've definitely broadened my scope there, and you were saying you had too. But equally, I think, I don't know, it's interesting. There's quite a few different things going on. I'm sure we'll touch on them to some extent, but like you have the rebounding. So at the start of this election cycle, I thought I was going to be stuck in a Conservative seat because they've essentially added a load of countryside onto our town area constituency. And although now it looks like it's going to actually not be Tory. So it seems like the polls, which are pretty damning for the Conservatives, are, and it wouldn't surprise me, given, as we said in our last episode where we talked about local elections, I was like, well, this is a place where we've gone from having a Tory council to having a Lib Dem council. It would not surprise me if we therefore go Lib Dem with the MP. But looking at the numbers like a month ago, that wasn't the story. I don't know. 6 weeks feels like a very short time. What's wild is, obviously, we recorded our last episode just before the announcement. I actually put a little thing in to the front of the episode saying, hey, we know that's been announced, but here's some info on local elections. Maybe that can inform. And I think, like, I still think it was worth doing the episode we did. And even with that slight delay, you can look at how things happen in the locals and how that may map onto a general election. That's a useful thing to have a chat about. But it's the fact that we're now 3 weeks away from the election already. And it's like, oh, what? Like, how did that happen? 6 weeks, the first half's gone.
Correct. And can I just say, in our defence, we were shocked by the election, but so were half of the Tory MPs, right? So I don't think
Yes.
we can be too guilty on ourselves for not predicting that a general election was days away. I mean, like,
I just doubled down on November 10th, if I recall. So.
Yeah. And I think the Conservatives who'd booked their holidays and all the MPs who had lovely summer holidays planned had done the same. It was bizarre. Like, so like maybe before we jump into it too much, like the actual, let's talk about the process of how this all happened, who fired the starting gun. It was like what happened on that morning. You have to realize, and like looking back is bizarre, is not only did we have Grant Shapps on TV saying people should probably have a stock of tinned meat and vegetables just in case something bad happens. People should prepare for that. That's what the government is suggesting. But also, the economy had a slight uptick, like growth was slightly better than expected, or wasn't as bad as it. Like I can't remember. It was like a 0.2 tick, and something in Rishi Sunak's head went, "Well, that's as good as it's going to get." that is as far as things are concerned, as far as economic news goes. That's great. Let's call the general election now. And of course, did it in a speech which wasn't memorable for its content, more the imagery of him being soaked in the rain and Labour's New Labour's anthem, I guess, of things can only get better, being blasted out, trying to drown him out. And for me, it just, that start of the election campaign showed a couple of things for me. One is that, the Tories knew they had to call it at one point, and so were scrabbling around for any good bit of news, and they kind of panicked a little bit, I think, in calling that election. And two, and I think this has been shown a lot as we talk about the campaign and like kind of the own goals inflicted by Rishi Sunak, I think, but it shows that he's not very good at politics, and by that I mean that he was clearly a capable Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? He's very good with his spreadsheets and behind a desk and planning things out like that. I think that's what people enjoyed about him, that he wasn't Boris Johnson and he was meant to be this steady hand at the tiller. However, when it comes to election campaigns, messaging, getting sort of like the mood of the country, he does appear to have slipped up in lots of ways on that front. Number one being that when you are Prime Minister, you have a lot of advantages at your hand that the opposition don't have. Number one of those being is when you're meant to call the general election. So you can time it perfectly. You can catch the opposition on the hop. You can have a manifesto written. You can have all your candidates selected for seats. You can have all of that in place and then fire the starting gun. And Rishi Sunak, by seemingly surprising the majority of his own MPs who weren't expecting it, who'd made other plans, who now are having to scrabble for seats, and there's rumours that they don't even have their like election literature printed yet. The Tories were caught on the hop so much more than arguably Labour were by this decision. You have to ask yourself the question: why did Rishi Sunak make it so hard for himself when he was already facing such an uphill battle to begin with?
Yeah, it did. Like we were predicting November, right? Like I just taken that from several podcasts that were kind of saying, well, you wouldn't want to clash too much with the American election. Although, as I think we said last episode to some extent, I don't think it actually matters that much. Like, people are still going to go out and vote. Like, no, I'm sure it's possible that someone could be confused between the two if they follow both them. But like, most people are going to know the difference between their own election and one in the US, right? So, like, I think, vanishing small chance of any real confusion, it does make it harder for the people in the news to talk about both things because they're trying to fill airtime, but and both things will be competing. But realistically, I don't think it matters that much because we're different countries. And if you care about local issues, you're going to care about your local issues. And if you care about world politics, you care about world politics. And most people could have space to care about both if they wanted to. But there was also the idea that then they could have it after, they could maybe have another mini budget and try and get some stuff in there as sweeteners for the Conservatives. And then also the idea that they could have it after their there was something about if they called it at a certain point, they could have their conference and then basically stop the Labour conference from happening, was one of the, to do with how you can't have a conference during electioneering or something. I'm not sure if that's strictly, I've understood that correctly, but there was some kind of talk about how could the Conservatives, using their position of choosing when the election is, scupper Labour's plans. And it seems like they've gone and shot themselves in the foot. It's just a complete, it was just like, what? Why is this happening today? And you've seen all the knock-on effects. I don't know if we want to go too deep into kind of these, but like things like Rishi Sunak going, oh, well, I can't be at the D-Day thing because the election's now in the way and I have to go do this talk over here. And you're like, but the D-Day planning, like, as you're head of state and well, no, sorry, he's not head of state. The king is head of state. But you know what I mean? Like, he's meant to be there with all the other bigwigs. And he's like, oh, well, actually, I've got to go off and film something for ITV. Very odd decisions coming because of how they've sprung this on themselves. But like, you can't really say you've sprung it on yourselves. You just made a weird choice.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. He fired the starting gun directly into his big toe and has been hopping along since then. You said we might touch on this. I think let's touch on it now. Like, the D-Day stuff is another good example of how Sunak doesn't appear to be very good at politics, because, as you said, Rishi Sunak is, like, he's not the head of state, but he's the prime minister. He gets to go there as the head of our legislature and represent us, which is an advantage that Keir Starmer doesn't have, right? That's one thing Keir Starmer can't do, is that. So you're in a really privileged position. And I understand that, like, being prime minister, you may have to leave something early if there's a disaster or something, right? If something goes wrong back home and your time is required elsewhere, that's fine. But the fact he did it for an interview with ITV, a pre-recorded interview, was again weird. It was something that I was listening to other podcasts talk about it because they've been talking about it in depth, and they said it was sort of on the media schedule for days before. This wasn't something that he did just on the day as a spur of a moment. This is what his campaign had always planned to do, and they did it without realizing how that would look around the rest of the country and the impact that it would have. Which, again, like, Labour didn't force him to do that. Labour didn't back him into a corner and say, oh, you know, you're wasting your time at these D-Day celebrations. You should be behind your desk always as Prime Minister. There was nothing there. It was just him doing this entirely of his own accord. And excuse me, yeah. And Labour can't believe their luck, I think, that they've had, particularly with that moment, which might be one that people look back at the same scale as, like, a Gordon Brown, that bigoted woman type of moment, something that sticks in your head, a gaffe on the election campaign, on election trail. That's the one that's sticking at the moment. And one of the reasons why it is, or why it becomes such a good attack line for Labour in particular, is, you know, we haven't discussed policies and manifestos yet, but one of the big policies that came out before the manifestos were out with the idea of national service, like bringing back national service for those who'd just turned 18. But it's voluntary national service because you can volunteer instead. But is it really voluntary if we make you do it? Like, lots of questions over that. It appeared to be a campaign policy dragged straight from the comment section of the Daily Mail website, right? Which is kind of told you where Rishi was going for his vote. He wanted to shore up the older vote, the grey vote, whatever you want to call it. Those are the type of people who are calling for those national service type of ideas. So if you're going to be supporting them and that's who you're going to double down on, don't leave D-Day early, because they're the people who will be most offended by you doing that. So that's why it appears so muddled, this election campaign for the Conservatives so far. And particularly, Rishi Sunak hasn't been helping himself in some of the he's done on the campaign.
Yeah, it just... I could stand here and just be like, I'm sure...
Why?
There are many things I could say, but I think probably the best kind of joke doing the rounds is, like, it's almost like he has a bet on for how badly he can lose the election. And he's leaning into it. Is there anything else we want to touch on? I think we're going to get to the manifestos in a second. Maybe we should mention the Lib Dems having an absolute whale of a time on the campaign trail. I think my particular favourite was Ed Davey on some teacups being interviewed about his latest policy.
Ed Davey's taking this opportunity to go around the country and just have a nice time, isn't he? But I think the Lib Dems, I'll talk about their manifesto in more depth, but I think they've got a really good idea of who they are and what they want to do at this election and what the Lib Dems stand for, which was, like, if I compare it to elections of old where we've had it, so you had Nick Clegg doing unexpectedly well in 2010 and, you know, leading opinion polls. You had Clegg Mania, which bubbled up and then didn't turn into seats, and then the coalition hurt their brand. But of course, I think Nick Clegg's campaign was incredibly successful and focused in on a disaffected third party feeling within British politics at the time. 2015 was bad, obviously, post coalition. 2019, the 2017, the Theresa May election against Jeremy Corbyn the first time round. That was Jo Swinson, and Jo Swinson was walking around, and she said pretty like directly to the public, "I could be the next prime minister," right? Which made a lot of people think, like, how engaged with reality are you? Like, it's Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer could theoretically be prime minister, and the Lib Dems could be. There's nothing stopping them. Like, they stand in all the seats. They could, but considering everything else, the fact that that was what she was running with, it just undermined her entire argument, because every time she sat down to talk to somebody, they went, "You, prime minister, really? Come on," and they were always on the back foot. Whereas I think Ed Davey is in a position now, and the Lib Dems are in a position where they're like, we know that we're a party that wants to give a voice, so we almost want to be like a pressure group, a protest party that will make sure that when we have a voice in Parliament, we will fight for you on these issues. Like the specific one Ed Davey's been running on is care, which I think is a great issue, because not many of the other big parties are talking about it seriously. So the vibes around the Lib Dems are good. I think Ed Davey has the right sort of strategy going into this election. Don't present yourself as a prime minister, like the teacups thing. Keir Starmer isn't going to do that. If Rishi Sunak, they wouldn't be called serious, like falling off of things into sewage, or going on a bike down a hill, Mr. Bean style. It's funny. It keeps the Lib Dems in the news. It keeps them in the public consciousness, and it makes people in areas where the Lib Dems are a viable alternative to Labour or Conservatives think, yeah, actually, they're all right. I understand they won't win, but in an election where it appears the winner is already decided, having a Lib Dem voice in Parliament, one that can pressure whoever's in charge with those things, I think is a good thing to market and try and sell to the voters. So yeah, he's doing well and having fun, becoming a little bit of a meme as he does it.
And I think that's clearly a bit targeted. I might try and get it into the show notes. There was a video I watched which was Erin Edinger, who's Edinger. I think it's Edinger. Like, it's a German-looking name, but he's American. And he did like a summary of all the different TikToks that are coming from the different parties, and it was quite interesting. It's like the Lib Dems, they bring a good meme, and they like Labour's not bad either, but it's like you look at the Conservatives and Reform, and it's like they're just showing clips of people talking, whereas not some of Labour's are like, here's a party political broadcast, but some of them at least feel like they could have been found on TikTok, whereas the Lib Dems are much more like, here's a silly thing, isn't that hilarious? And when you're the third party, I don't think that's an unreasonable ploy, because it gets people talking about you. And we know that Lib Dems tend to pick up some disaffected Tory voters. There are definitely seats like the one I'm in, which will probably go from Tory to Lib Dem, as opposed to Reform, because Reform will, in most places, because of how first past the post works, Reform will just kind of eat the Tories' vote share, leaving it in a position where it can swing. So I think there's partly that, like putting the Lib Dems out there. But he is, I know he's out there having fun, but he's also talking about serious issues while he's doing it. That teacups one, he's talking about rejoining the single market. And he then also put out a really affecting piece about having to be a carer for his son and also one of his parents. And it's like, very humanized him. So someone who's not necessarily that well known, which is kind of, you talked about Cleggmania. Nick Clegg went from being like, if you knew a bit about politics, you knew who he was, to being front and center by doing various things. And I think it's a similar kind of strategy. They know they're not going to win off it. You can look at the polls and see, but the Lib Dems could double their seats this election, which would be good for them. Hypothetically, looking at some of the numbers, they could be the official opposition. Like there are reasons to get your name out there and make people go, oh, well, I don't Tory, I don't Labour. What's the other option? Well, it's the Lib Dems, right? A lot of, there is definitely, that affects some people. They go in, they look at the list and they're like, well, I don't want this one, I don't want that one. I've heard of that one. That happens. So,
and there is like big props. I think what the Lib Dems do is like really good. They're very effective campaigners. So that Ed Davey piece on him being a carer has not stopped being one of my YouTube videos, like pre-roll ads, for a while now. And I think that's because I'm now in, we talked about rebanding earlier, because part of the rebanding, I'm not going to have Jacob Rees-Mogg as my MP next time, no matter what happens, because he's in the one next door. We've been subsumed into one that's looking like a Lib Dem Conservative marginal, and certainly Labour aren't. We haven't had any Labour literature through the door. We've only had Lib Dems. So Lib Dems go for places really well. They run on local issues. So my local Lib Dem campaigner has been talking about there are no NHS dentists in Somerset. So I'm going to run and go on like, we need more NHS dentists out there. Okay, great. I don't think I would have got that promise from my Conservative person putting that. And when we're talking about how the Conservatives are looking to run this campaign and where they're looking to defend, I think they might start to defend the Lib Dem Conservative marginals more than they do the Labour ones. Because what the Lib Dems do so well is once they are in a seat, they hold on to it for their dear life. They limp it on. They make sure that they are the best darn local MP that they can do, and they're quite old-fashioned in that sense. Compare that to, well, let's compare it to Reform. If Nigel Farage gets in Clacton, I don't think he's going to be a great MP for Clacton. I don't think he'll be running surgeries every week because Nigel Farage has a TV show to be on and places to do and things to be as leader of the party that means that he can't be a good representative of that constituency. Lib Dems almost, to a person, never fail to really go strong on local issues and make that constituency their life because they understand that's how you build these things. If you want to stay as the third party, if you want to make sure that you're still reliable the next time the election comes around, then you build from that base. And the damage that was done from them being in the coalition in 2010, I think is starting to be undone, or people are seeing that as a more distant memory now. They're not holding the grudge and they see that Ed Davey's Lib Dems are very different. So, it'd be a good election for them.
Yeah. No, and it remains to be seen, but we've seen some interesting polls. I just saw someone was saying Penny Mordaunt is at risk of losing her seat. And part of that's Portsmouth North. And it's basically it's one of those interesting kind of tactical voter situations because it's like, oh, the Lib Dems, if they vote Labour there, then they can get Penny Mordaunt out and then stuff like that. So I think there's going to be some really interesting little side things to look at where it's like, I was talking about this a bit with someone the other day. So like the Lib Dems, as we say, are very good at cleaning up these kind of seats where if you split the very right vote into Conservative and Reform, and then Lib Dems can kind of come in where Labour wouldn't have a chance. So I think there's a great chance for them to pick up a load of seats and do really well off the back of that. What will be interesting is seeing those kind of very narrow marginals and how they affect things there. And does it flip it one way or the other? Just looking at the mapping of the numbers of all these polls that are coming out, it's probably going to be the Lib Dems will be eating good, as it were, off this. I don't think they'll be quite at 2010 numbers, but to have recovered in, I guess, they before 2010, right? Lib Dems were there, but they didn't really do particularly well. They always held about 20 seats. And then 2010, they did really well, got into the coalition, and then that scuppered them for the next few. And I think this is now we're actually seeing that resurgence again of they've learned from their mistakes there, and they are once again appealing to the kind of voters they did before. And, they can't go and undo the tuition fees thing. So, that's where it is. This is what we have to deal with.
Yeah. But I think many of the figures of that time have moved on, right? Like if Nick Clegg was still in charge, I think you would still see people holding those grudges. But it feels like they've cycled out. It's a very different feeling to what you had like in the Conservatives, for example. It doesn't feel like they've cycled round, or that you can't. It's too soon to wash away Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. If you're Rishi Sunak, those people are still in your party and still in your cabinet. Whereas the Lib Dems can say, "Oh yeah, no, Ed Davey, what was he doing in 2010? I don't know. Maybe he was involved in some way, but he's kept that very hidden, hasn't he?"
Yeah, I mean, Ed Davey was he like no, but when he did something during the coalition, so he did have a role, and I can't tell you what it is, and I'm paying attention. So let's put it that way. Like precisely. They've done a good job of making you forget. So before we move into the manifestos, do we want to talk a bit about Labour's campaigning? Has that been going well?
I think for the most part it has. It's been quite like a safe campaign. It's weird in a sense that they're like Labour almost feel like the incumbent because they're the ones with like they're the ones everybody expects to come in, so they don't want to mess it up. There is an analogy that has been used on lots of podcasts, so I shall use it here as well. Have you heard of the Ming vase?
I have. I've heard of newscasts trying to get rid of it as a thing to say.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. You all you need to do is transport that Ming vase across the neatly polished floor and place it on the pedestal, but you don't want to mess it up. So they're trying to be super, super safe as they get across that polished floor, which I think is a nice analogy they've got in head for how they're trying to do it and how it seems to be one that is relatively risk-free. The one talking point that's come up, I think, or the one sort of faux pas they had that stayed at the top of the news cycle for a couple of days was all of this around selection, and particularly that of Diane Abbott. The party has already decided that Jeremy Corbyn is not going to be representing Labour, so he may stand as an independent in his seat. There were rumblings where Diane Abbott was suspended for the party because of things she'd said, and it had taken an awful long time to try and get her back into the party or not. We got mixed messages that she was back in the party but not standing as MP. Diane Abbott then released a statement saying that, yes, Labour HQ had confirmed that she couldn't stand for Labour MP. Keir Starmer then came back saying, I didn't tell her any of the such thing, and there were rumours flying around. As it's turned out, Diane Abbott will be standing as a Labour MP in the next election, but it took an awful lot of fuss to get there, and there is a sort of a so-called purge of the Labour left, all of those Corbynistas who were around in the original days, if they can be deselected, or if you've got a choice between a centrist candidate and a more sort of momentum-backed left candidate, who gets the pick for the final selections? Oh, look at that, it's the more centrist person, as he tries to get sort of Keir Starmer's Labour Party to be the one that wins the seats rather than having too loud a voice on the left. So there are rumblings there, and I think it has upset some of those on the left of the party enough where a few might think of voting Green in some places. The Greens have had a big surge, particularly in Bristol, Thagnham Debonair, I believe it is, one with a huge majority last time. She was part of the Corbyn cabinet, or at least was close. And that was an election where it was Corbyn versus Johnson, so it made sense to have a Labour candidate. Now in this election, where Labour looks like it might win, I do wonder if some of those places will reject a Labour candidate and vote Green to make sure they've got somebody a bit more sort of radical or on the left in charge. So it hasn't all been plain sailing for Keir, but the problems seem to have come from within his own party, and particularly on those selection choices, rather than from externally. Get what I mean? So, yeah, just thought I'd bring that up. That it's very interesting to see where, as Keir tries to mould the party in his own image, you still see those growing pains. You still see those bits of resistance from the wings of the party who are trying to make sure that their voices are still heard. Because personally, I think it's good that if you have a wide tent of voices within any political party, you want to hear all views.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting seeing, because I know a variety of people on the left side of the spectrum. There are some people who are very shocked about the whole Diane Abbott thing and were saying, they've not handled this well. But then you have other people who are like, realistically, she's at the point where she's had a really good run and she should probably retire and stop saying daft stuff. And it's like, there probably is a medium between those 2 points, which is closer to the truth, right? But that's the kind of position they're in, where it's like, the reason she was being investigated is she wrote a very poorly thought out piece that kind of dismissed. Well, I mean, eventually she was found to be okay, right? That was the summary. But essentially, the way it was written dismissed certain types of racism and anti-Semitism. And this was all around when there was the whole Jeremy Corbyn being anti-Semitic thing. So it wasn't a good look at that time. And you could have just not published that piece. If it was that kind of thing, it was a very odd misstep, and I'm not sure why she did it. I mean, I don't know her. I have no reason to know. But it's one of the things where you could have just not published this thing, and you wouldn't have got into this silly situation. I think Labour's going to have so many new MPs coming in with the election that it doesn't matter if you have a few people who are maybe occasionally causing silly headlines, because it will be diluted by the fact that you will have so many MPs in government. At the moment, she's managed to draw probably more headlines to herself than you would if it was after the election. Obviously, it ties into the election directly. That's part of it. But it is interesting seeing that. Like, you have people who are all on the left going the whole spectrum from she should probably retire now and just, she was the first female black MP. She has all of that legacy. And there are some people basically saying, it would be a good time to retire and not mess up your legacy by doing anything else that's a bit silly. And then on the other side, you have people going, oh, it's terrible that they've kind of tried to push her out. And that's all within the left kind of side of Labour. That's not even, I don't think, out of the group of people I'm talking to, I wouldn't call any of them centrist people. So it's interesting seeing there's that whole wide range about this one issue within Labour. And I think Labour is and will end up being quite a broad house. People you said about a leftist purge. There are still people in there, like there's maybe not necessarily Corbyn's mates, the Corbynistas that we had before, who were very left. But that doesn't mean you don't have a wide range from, you have the kind of general feel Labour's going for is we're kind of in the centre and we're quite sensible, please vote us in. But we know from before, like under Tony Blair, for example, you had Corbyn as a Labour MP. Like, you always had that breadth in the party. And when you have what looks like maybe 400 MPs in government, you're going to have a range. Those people aren't going to all agree. And I think that's often how it ends up with Labour governments when they're in power. So I guess, yeah, it felt like a gaffe. I think they managed to get away with it mostly because it was kind of more political inside football. Like, I think it does care. The people who care are people who are quite politically switched on. Whereas the D-Day thing, on the flip side, that hits a broader swathe of people who are going to go, oh, that was a bad look.
Yes, I think you're right there. I think one of the reasons it made more headlines than might have expected, it depends on the candidate, right? Like, if it's a left-wing candidate you haven't heard of, it doesn't matter. But it's Diane Abbott, and Diane Abbott is, unfortunately, you have these sort of within politics these boogeymen, that the figures within your party that you might like within your own side, but the other side detests for various reasons, right? So, for example, the Lib Dems always used to put like Michael Gove on their leaflet. They used to go, "Oh, look at Michael Gove. If you're a natural Lib Dem supporter, you don't like Michael Gove. You think he's a bit slimy, right?" And then, to very good effect, like if you think about how Jeremy Corbyn's name was used as a boogeyman in the Boris Johnson years, it was him and unfortunately Diane Abbott were used as these sort of figureheads of, don't vote them in. This person represents the entire party, and you dislike them, don't you? So they're used as sort of like shorthand figures for like why you shouldn't vote for them. Lib Dem leaflets now have Liz Truss's face on them because you remind people that Liz Truss is still a part of the Conservative Party and the bad things she's did. She's widely unpopular as a politician, but even more so with people who aren't already Conservative. So they lean in on that. Angela Rayner, unfortunately, this time for Keir Starmer, is being used as that as well, divisive figure, at least on the right. So yeah, I think that's why it got so much, unfortunately. But good for Diane for sticking to her guns. She will probably still be the MP for Hackney by the end of this time, and yeah, see what she can do the next.
Yeah, and I guess a thing we can pay attention to as once the election's over, it'll be interesting having that, like, because this has been such a short time period, we're going to have maybe 2 episodes on the election, really. I know we've always been talking about the polls in the run-up, but it's going to be interesting having such that short time scale, and then it will be like, well, do things change under Labour? And these names will come back, I guess. Yeah, thank you as always, Rob, for joining me. You can find us in all the usual places. Parliamentary.observer, a web domain I can't believe they still let us have. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on X still, and you can find us on Instagram at Unpal Podcast. You can find us on Facebook by searching for Unparliamentary Language. And also, if you want to listen to our bonus episodes and you just think you like what we do and you want to throw $1 our way to support our web hosting costs and things like that, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. And I guess that means there's nothing left for me to do other than to say it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.